Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Halloween weekend in Windsor, Berkshire. A quiet cul-de-sac, porch lights still out from the early evening. Two children step through their mother's doorway after routine contact time. By dawn, officers will force that same door and find what matters most in cases like this, evidence that speaks even when a victim cannot. Joanna Simpson was 46, a mother, cautious and organized. Friends knew the handovers could be tense. That Sunday night, she moved through small rituals, texting a check-in, lining up school items, keeping the space calm. After the children settled, her phone goes still. Messages that usually get a quick reply don't. A neighbor notices lights on, then off, then silence. By morning, concern becomes procedure, a welfare check. Entry is controlled. The search pattern is standard: call out, clear room to room, halt when the first anomaly turns the air heavy. The house is intact, but what's on the surfaces isn't. Investigators mark patterns that don't belong to a domestic evening: cast off, transfer, interrupted cleanup. No body. That absence doesn't relax anyone, it narrows the question set. Where is Joanna, and how did this space come to look like this? We catalog what's here and what's not. First, visible blood distribution consistent with blunt force impacts in a confined zone, then movement away from that zone. Second, indications of a hurried removal, drag vectors or lift points suggested by where traces start and stop. Third, an ordinary home missing what usually accompanies accidental harm: no emergency call placed, no efforts for medical help, no explanatory injuries consistent with a misstep on stairs or a fall against furniture. The data aligns too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem. In the first hours, it stays clinical. Scenes are photographed, swabbed, and gridded. A timeline board starts on the dining table: last verified messages, the precise window between the handover and the first unanswered calls, the likely minute-by-minute sequence that transforms a family home into a primary scene with no victim present. Officers canvass the street with narrow questions: did you hear a struggle? Did you see a vehicle arrive, idle, or depart? Did any security light trigger? The responses are typical of a Sunday night in a quiet town: few specifics, stray fragments, times people think they remember. In towns like this, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of what people believe about their own street. We keep the children's privacy intact here, on purpose. Their experience informs the urgency but does not enter the record we repeat for public consumption. Instead, we concentrate on verifiable movement. If a body left this house, it did so along a route that will appear in some system, on a camera, under a license plate reader, inside a fuel receipt, or through soil on a tire well. When a suspect narrative emerges later, it will have to live alongside what the fluids, distances, and minutes already told us. Within hours, a person connected to Joanna contacts police requesting to talk about a serious domestic incident. That conversation won't be described here, it's logged, and it will matter. For now, what matters more is what the house already said. The first facts are sufficient to reset the posture from missing person to suspected domestic homicide with body not on site. That shift triggers resources, specialist search, senior investigating officers, and a wider net for anything that left tracks overnight. There is no speculation in this opening chapter because we don't need it. The house spoke clearly: repeated blunt force, a deliberate removal, an absence of any effort to save a life. From this point, the case will move outdoors. When it does, we measure miles against minutes and let the ground tell the rest. By mid-morning, the case moved from a silent house to a quiet interview room. A man connected to Joanna Simpson contacted police and asked to talk about a serious domestic incident. He arrived at the station voluntarily and was taken into custody. The posture shifted: this was no longer a welfare check. It was a suspected domestic homicide with the primary scene established at Joanna's home and a victim unaccounted for. The first recorded interview set the tone. With legal counsel present, responses were limited: short, careful, or no comment. Investigators didn't argue with the silence, they documented it. They worked a different angle: timeline tension. They laid out the verified window between the children's return and the first unanswered calls to Joanna, then the hours that followed, where no medical help was sought, no neighbors were alerted, and no credible accident narrative surfaced. When the data aligns neatly, it invites a second look. It did here. The next hours were procedural, not theatrical. Detectives requested access to devices, recent movements, and any items removed from the home. They compared the caller's account with what the scene had already said. The scene described sustained blunt force and a removal event. The caller did not offer an alternative that fit those facts. That gap became leverage. What changed the direction wasn't a dramatic confession. It was a small shift in language after counsel conferred with the client. The tone moved from categorical silence to a constrained claim of loss of control. The phrasing mattered because it implied an assault without emergency aid and acknowledged an aftermath that required action. It didn't explain where Joanna was. Pressed on that point with photographs from the house and the documented lack of any 911 equivalent in the UK, the interview introduced a new element, a large plastic storage box purchased previously at a garden center. The reference was brief, but it opened a lane the team could drive down. From that moment, the inquiry expanded beyond the front door. If a body left the house in a container, the movement should be traceable: vehicle capacity, ingress and egress patterns, fuel, parking stops, and any route that favored concealment. Investigators prioritized terrain within practical driving distance of Windsor and Ascot, areas with woodland cover, discreet pull-offs, or accesses that could be approached and left without attention. Windsor Great Park rose on that list for obvious reasons: size, seclusion in places, and familiarity to anyone living nearby. The man in custody did not provide a long narrative. He provided just enough to justify controlled field work under police supervision. That meant an escorted site visit, not a free-form search. Senior officers coordinated logistics, scene technicians on standby, search teams briefed to treat every square meter as potential evidence, and transport prepared to maintain chain of custody if remains were located. Nothing about the plan assumed cooperation beyond what had already been said. The teams were briefed to expect partial directions or last-minute changes. At the same time, backroom analysts worked a parallel track. They re-examined recent financial activity for purchases consistent with the described container and tools. They reviewed any prior references to the park area, hikes, family outings, or routes to and from work that could explain familiarity. They compared typical travel times at night against the known window and ran a feasibility clock. How long would it take to subdue, contain, load, and drive from the house to Woodland, then return without drawing attention? The clock made sense. That was the issue. It made a kind of operational sense that favored planning over panic. The next custodial session stayed narrow. Counsel guarded against overreach. Investigators stuck to verified points. When asked directly about the park, the response did not contradict the suggestion. It did not confirm it in full either. A supervised drive was proposed. The man agreed under terms set by police. Vehicles were prepared. Documentation was ready. The team understood the stakes. If the lead was real, recovery would resolve the family's worst question. If it was a deflection, the day would still map valuable ground for subsequent systematic searches. There's a human side even inside a cold room. Cases like this force a community to measure what it trusts: a safe street, a familiar face, the idea that harm announces itself before it happens. It often doesn't. In towns like Windsor, violence can arrive with no warning, then disappear into the dark along routes people drive every day. That's why procedure matters. It disciplines the search when instinct wants to speculate. The man was escorted out under police control for the site visit. Teams deployed to the park perimeter and internal tracks. Radios stayed clear. The instruction was simple: if there is a burial, we will find it and preserve it properly. If there isn't, we will still know more than we knew this morning. The move to the park was quiet and deliberate. A supervised drive left the station with marked and unmarked units staggered to avoid attention. Search teams staged at known pull-ins around Windsor Great Park, wide enough for a vehicle to stop briefly at night, close enough to tree lines to hide activity from the road. The brief was simple: if a burial exists, we document first, touch nothing, and keep a clean chain from ground to mortuary. Within the park, the landscape narrowed the likely zones. Investigators prioritized areas with vehicle access, soft ground, and cover from casual walkers. The escort vehicle followed directions that were neither detailed nor evasive: short instructions, small corrections, an eventual stop along a discrete track. From there, the team moved on foot, slow and systematic. A search lead called a halt at subtle terrain changes, a patch where leaf litter looked newer than the surrounding floor, soil colors slightly different, and a rectangular depression that wasn't natural. Those cues aren't dramatic, they are reliable. Once that rectangle drew focus, the process turned technical. A perimeter was set with tape. Photography and video captured the site before disturbance. Metal tools were kept to a minimum to avoid inadvertent marks. Trowels, brushes, and screens replaced shovels. As the upper layer came off in measured lifts, the shape held straight edges. The smell changed, earth to something else, an indicator every forensic technician recognizes. The team paused to widen the frame for context shots, then resumed. The first man-made object to appear was a section of plastic, smooth, rigid, the kind used for large domestic storage boxes. Soil and leaf matter sealed the rim. The container was intact enough to lift as a whole unit. That mattered: it preserved what was inside and locked the timeline to the point of burial. Lifting was done with slings to avoid prying under stress points. The box was placed on a clean tarp for exterior swabs and serial photographs, then sealed for transport. Only when the pathologist was present at a controlled facility would it be opened. Nearby, searchers logged a spade and a section of tarpaulin partially concealed in brush. Each item received its own evidence number, bag, and location sketch. No one editorialized, the site spoke adequately. A pre-dug hole plus a storage container is not improvisation. It indicates intention and time. Transport ran to protocol. The container and tools were loaded into a designated vehicle with a scene officer riding along to maintain continuity. The route to the mortuary avoided unnecessary stops. At intake, the pathologist took custody. The container was opened with documentation running in parallel: timestamp, personnel present, sequence of removal. Inside were human remains consistent with a woman of Joanna Simpson's age and build, clothed in home attire rather than outdoor wear. No valuables were recovered. The exterior of the container bore transfer consistent with it having been handled by gloved hands. Latent and DNA processing would follow. The post-mortem was concise and decisive. The pathologist documented multiple impacts to the head, approximately 14 distinct strike sites, consistent with a claw hammer. Defensive injuries indicated an attempt to protect against blows. There were no injuries consistent with a single accidental fall or a short drop. The distribution and number of strikes made the medical question straightforward: this was homicide. Time since death aligned with the night of the handover. No medical intervention had been attempted after the initial assault. Back at the house, these findings tightened the reconstruction. The assault zone explained the initial blood patterning. The removal traces matched the loading of a container. The distance between home and burial site fit within the quiet night window calculated by analysts. There was no credible room left for an accident narrative or a spontaneous act followed by panic. The park site, with its straight-sided pit and plastic box, reflected forethought, at minimum, preparation for concealment. With recovery complete, officers notified family through a trained liaison. There is no efficient version of that conversation. The focus remained professional. We had located Joanna, we had secured the evidence, and the legal process would account for what the facts showed. Human moments matter in these cases, but they do not replace the record. The record is what carries weight in court and, later, when the public asks why certain decisions were made. From an investigative perspective, the case moved from strong suspicion to evidentiary confirmation. We now had a primary scene, a secondary scene, a body, a likely weapon type, and a sequence of actions that could be explained to a jury in plain language. The next steps were predictable: complete lab work on the container and tools, finalize the autopsy report, and integrate all of it into a charging file that matched facts to law. The day ended as it began, with quiet. No dramatics over the radio, no speeches at the tape line. Just a clear path from a house in Windsor to a grave in the park, and back to a room where the facts would be read into the record. The search day ended with answers. The next day started with clocks and maps. Reconstruction work is simple on paper and hard in practice. Line up what we know against what the night allows. If a person is assaulted in a house in Windsor, removed in a container, and buried in a straight-sided pit in Windsor Great Park, the movements have to fit a narrow window without drawing attention. Our job here is to lock that window. We began with verified timestamps. The children were home after contact time on October 31, 2010. Communications to Joanna's phone stopped later that evening. The welfare check occurs the next morning, November 1st. In between, there is no emergency call, no request for help, and no credible accidental scenario. That gives investigators a bracket to test: a late evening departure from the residence, a short drive to a secluded park access, burial activity on soft ground, and a return trip that avoids notice. Vehicle capacity matters before route choice. A domestic storage box large enough to contain an adult does not move itself. It requires lift points, a clear path to a vehicle, and a boot or rear area that can close over the container. At the house, doorway widths and steps are measured. The path to the driveway is unobstructed enough for a single person to manage with effort. That is not speculation, it is a check any jury can understand. Can one person physically do this in that space? The answer is yes. With feasibility cleared, analysts model travel times using ordinary speeds on local roads between the address and multiple candidate park entrances. Nighttime conditions reduce traffic but do not eliminate chance encounters. The favored route is short, direct, and avoids main gates. Pull-ins exist on narrow tracks that allow a vehicle to stop briefly without line of sight to the main road. Those locations match the search staging from the recovery day. When you overlay the map with the time bracket, the drive out and the drive back each fit well within the available minutes. What remains is the burial itself. Straight sides mean a spade, not hands. A hole that size is not dug in a few frantic minutes unless it existed beforehand. The ground at the site shows consistency with previous disturbance, soil color and compaction differences below the leaf litter. That tells investigators this was not an improvised pit dug after a sudden outburst. The hole predated the night. Preparation of a container and a pit points to forethought, at minimum, planning to conceal. Financial records align with the physical picture. A transaction tied to a garden center purchase of a large plastic storage box appears in the period before the homicide. It matches the material recovered from the grave. This is not a flourish, it is the bridge from a statement in an interview to an objective record and a physical exhibit. If you claim a container existed, and a receipt shows such a container was recently bought, and that container is now in evidence, the chain is straightforward. The feasibility clock also accounts for the children. Their presence at the start of the night means any movement from house to car had to be quick, controlled, and quiet. No neighbor reports a loud engine running for long durations. No CCTV clip shows a vehicle idling at the curb. That pushes the model toward efficient loading and immediate departure. It is not heroic, it is mechanical: minutes in the house, minutes on the road, minutes at the site. On the technical side, plate recognition is inconsistent around rural park roads in 2010. The absence of an ANPR hit does not disprove the route. Instead, investigators rely on a combination of witness canvas near access tracks, tire mark impressions where available, and the very existence of the grave and the container. The route does not need to be captured frame by frame if the end state is recovered and the timeline supports a plausible movement within the bracketed hours. We also looked for noise in the data, anything that would challenge this model. A detour? A fuel purchase at an odd hour? A call ping placing a key phone far from Windsor? None clears the bar. The data align in a way that makes operational sense. That alone is not guilt. It is, however, a foundation strong enough to explain to a jury, this could be done in this time, by one person, using this route and that pit, and the remains we recovered confirm someone did exactly that. There is a human element to reconstruction that deserves a line. People want crimes to look dramatic because drama is legible. Real cases are often quiet. A short drive, a short dig, a short return. What lasts are the consequences. That is why these timelines matter. They convert doubt into a sequence the law can use, and they respect the victim by refusing to cloud the record with guesswork. By the end of this phase, the model is fixed. The house is the assault scene. The park is the burial scene. The container is the link. The bracketed hours are sufficient for travel and concealment. Loss of control does not explain a pre-dug hole and a box purchased in advance. That is not rhetoric, it is the point where logistics undercut narrative. Back at the incident room, the case moved into a different gear. Recovery gave us certainty about cause and manner, now the file had to meet charging standards. That means linking what the scene showed to what the paper and the pixels could corroborate, receipts, movement records, and statements that either hold or fracture under pressure. Detectives started with the container. The burial produced a large plastic storage box intact enough to examine. Serial photographs documented its make and size. Procurement officers pulled local sales for matching models over the weeks before the homicide. A garden center transaction surfaced with a time, date, and card reference consistent with the interview mention. Where store CCTV was retained, it showed the aisle and the till, not a face scan, it didn't need to. The value here was alignment, stated purchase, financial record, and a physical exhibit that ended up around a body in a woodland grave. Next was the ground. Soil from the grave, soil from the house exterior, and transfer collected from the container rim moved through lab trays. The goal wasn't a cinematic match, it was consistency, same mineral profile, plant matter in line with Windsor Great Park leaf litter, trace grit that explained how the box was set down and lifted. The science was modest, but it closed gaps. This container traveled through that park, into that hole. The autopsy report settled the medical questions. 14 discrete impact sites to the head, patterns consistent with a claw hammer, defensive injuries to the hands and forearms, no evidence of a single sudden fall, no intervention afterward. Time since death aligned with the night of the handover. Those findings went into the file in plain language. Jurors don't need jargon, they need clarity about what happened and when. Here, clarity was brutal and simple. Device work was limited but useful. Joanna's phone activity stops late on October 31st. There is no outgoing call for help, no text sent after the window in which neighbors heard nothing out of the ordinary. Where cell site information was available, it kept the phone at or near the house before it went silent. There was no evidence of a theft or random intrusion. It was a domestic environment that became a crime scene inside a narrow band of minutes. Vehicle questions always matter in a removal case. Investigators photographed the family car, the driveway, any rubber marks near the curb, and ordinary where that might hold soil. Tool marks at the house suggested a heavy object had been moved. The doorway widths and step heights, already measured, fit the dimensions of the box. Put simply, one person could maneuver that container from the assault zone to a vehicle, load it, and drive without waking a street on a Sunday night. The interviews moved in parallel. With counsel present, the same individual shifted from blanket refusal to a partial narrative, loss of control after marital strain. That phrasing conceded a violent event inside the home but attempted to narrow intent. Prosecutors prepared for the obvious contest, murder versus manslaughter, by structuring the file around behavior, not adjectives. Behavior said this: a hole dug in advance, a container bought in advance, no emergency call, efficient loading, a direct route to a secluded track, a burial carried out with the composure required to leave a clean site and transport tools away. That sequence counts when a jury has to decide what loss of control can and cannot include. A parallel thread concerned the children. Their presence framed the timeline and the risk. The file handled this without spectacle. They were in the home earlier that evening, they were accounted for afterward, and no steps were taken to shield them from the proximity of lethal violence in the room next door. That's not a rhetorical flourish, it's a condition of the night that a court is entitled to weigh when it considers recklessness and disregard. One subtle but important piece was the park itself. Windsor Great Park is not a generic field. It has known tracks, known pull-ins, and an ecology that changes predictably with the season. The site we recovered wasn't a random dig, its straight sides and depth were consistent with planning time and daylight reconnaissance. Whether that reconnaissance happened days or weeks earlier doesn't matter as much as the fact it happened at all. You don't dig that box-shaped hole by torchlight after an argument. That was a line prosecutors were prepared to say out loud. When the charging package went to the Crown Prosecution Service, it carried a narrative that never overreached: primary scene assault, secondary scene concealment, corroborated purchase, feasible logistics, and a medical report that eliminated accident. The murder count was expected. Defense counsel signaled an alternative path: diminished responsibility, grounded in an adjustment disorder diagnosis. That's a legal landscape particular to England and Wales, and the team adjusted to it: psychiatric reports, prior stressors, and the narrow distinction between intent formed over time and a sudden impairment claim. This is where cases often fracture into arguments about feelings. Ours didn't. It stayed anchored in sequence. Lose your temper, and you might strike. You don't pre-dig a grave, buy a box, and perform a concealed burial during school night hours because you lost your temper once. That distinction isn't moral, it's operational. Jurors understand operations even when they disagree about motives. There's also the human line we owe the audience. Families don't get to choose the legal vocabulary that describes their loss. They live with what the evidence supports and what the law allows. The most respectful thing we can do is present the record without clutter, and that's what the file did. It gave the court a straight path from home to woodland, from impact marks to shovel cuts, from a retail purchase to a container under soil. With charges authorized, the route forward was set. A courtroom would decide whether forethought and the facts met the threshold for murder, or whether a psychiatric explanation would reduce it to manslaughter. Either way, the evidence had to stand alone. And it did. When the file reached court, the facts were familiar: a primary scene inside Joanna Simpson's home in Windsor, a secondary scene in Windsor Great Park, a storage box recovered intact, autopsy confirming multiple blunt force hit injuries, a burial consistent with planning. The dispute wasn't what happened. It was how the law should label it. The Crown charged murder. The defense signaled a plea to manslaughter on the ground of diminished responsibility, supported by psychiatric evidence of an adjustment disorder under the law of England and Wales. That statute doesn't excuse the killing. It asks whether an abnormality of mental functioning substantially impaired judgment or self-control at the time. The jury's task was to place the same timeline on one side of a legal line or the other. Opening for the prosecution was direct. Jurors were shown the sequence as operations, not emotion: advance purchase of a container, a grave dug before the night in question, an assault in a confined area, no emergency call, transport to a secluded track, concealment done carefully, tools removed. The theme was intent inferred from preparation and conduct. You don't build a burial plan by accident. The defense asked the jury to view the night as a collapse, not a scheme. Reports from clinicians described stressors around the divorce and money, claimed impaired decision-making, and emphasized the phrase loss of control. They acknowledged the assault and the burial, there was no way around that, but argued the mental state lowered culpability from murder to manslaughter. In this frame, the preparation the Crown called planning became the behavior of a distressed person trying to cope, badly and unlawfully. Legal directions mattered. The judge explained murder requires an intent to kill or cause really serious harm. Manslaughter by diminished responsibility requires proof of the mental impairment and its substantial effect. The jury heard that pre-event steps can demonstrate intent, while post-event concealment isn't, by itself, proof of premeditation. Both sides then returned to the exhibits. The container purchase connected a statement to a receipt and to a physical object recovered with the body. The pit's straight sides and depth suggested work done ahead of time. The burial location reduced the chance of discovery. The number and distribution of blows supported an inference of sustained force. Each point was explained in plain language, no technical jargon was needed. The defense didn't dispute the items, it disputed what they meant about state of mind. Witnesses were limited. Investigators summarized recovery and chain of custody. The pathologist set out cause and timing. A family liaison officer did the minimum required to establish identity and next of kin notifications, without inviting emotion into the record. The psychiatric experts answered questions about criteria for adjustment disorder, its symptoms, and how, in their view, it could impair judgment under pressure. The cross-examinations focused on consistency. If impairment was severe, how do you explain organized concealment? The answer offered was that impairment can coexist with method, even if that seems counterintuitive, and that distress can produce structured but irrational actions. Closing arguments drew the same map with different labels. The Crown asked the jury to weigh preparation and execution as evidence of intent. The defense asked them to note the collapse of judgment and the absence of a long-term murder plot. The judge reminded the panel that they must be sure of the Crown's case to convict of murder, and that if the defense had raised diminished responsibility on the balance of probabilities, the route to manslaughter was open. The verdict reflected that instruction. The jury rejected murder and returned manslaughter by diminished responsibility. A separate count, obstructing a coroner, addressed the concealment. Sentencing followed, a total of 26 years imprisonment, 24 for the homicide plus 2 for obstruction. The court recorded the gravity of the violence, the planning signals the Crown had proved, and the psychiatric mitigation the defense had established to the required standard. It was not an acquittal. It was a legal classification that reduced the count but not the harm. For the audience, the key is to understand why strong evidence of planning did not compel a murder verdict. Under this law, if the jury accepts substantial impairment, it can reduce the offense regardless of those planning indicators. That outcome can feel unsatisfying. It is, however, how the statute directs juries to resolve the conflict between behavior and mental state. Outside the courtroom, the family began the work no sentence can finish. Inside, the record closed with a single outcome and a single path forward, imprisonment under the manslaughter conviction and a long sentence measured in decades, not years. A verdict closes a trial, it doesn't close a life. After sentencing, the file left the courtroom and entered the long space where families live with outcomes the law can name but cannot repair. For Joanna Simpson's relatives and friends, that meant grief work, practical care for 2 children, and a decision. Remain silent or turn their loss into a public warning about domestic homicide and the patterns that precede it. They chose to speak, measured, factual, and focused on prevention. The message wasn't abstract. Homicide in a home usually follows escalation, control, isolation, threats, and then violence. Their advocacy stayed careful with details and anchored to what was proven in court, a lethal assault inside a residence, followed by concealment and a burial in Windsor Great Park. Nothing more, nothing less. In towns like this, the talk after a case can collapse into rumor. They fought that by keeping to the record and asking systems to learn from it. Behind the scenes, police and prosecutors conducted the standard post-case review. What worked? Early scene posture, the speed of the welfare check, the route modeling that made sense of minutes and miles, and a charging package that avoided overclaim. What needed emphasis going forward? The importance of documenting coercive behavior before violence, so risk flags don't rely on hindsight. That is not sensational, it's policy. Systems are stronger when warning signs are captured while a victim is still reachable. Media interest never fully disappeared. Coverage revisited the straight-sided grave, the storage box purchase, and the jury's decision to reduce the count to manslaughter under diminished responsibility. For the public, those facts pull in opposite directions, preparation that looks like intent, and a diagnosis the law recognizes as mitigation. The family kept a straight line through that debate. They didn't tell people what to think, they told people what happened, and they asked why early interventions aren't always available or used when households show risk. The children remained the quiet center of the story, protected, off camera, and out of transcripts. That boundary matters. True crime audiences deserve chronology and proof, not private pain. Our job as narrators is to draw a hard edge around what the case needs to teach and leave the rest alone. Here, the lesson is operational. Take patterns seriously, document them early, and treat loss of controlled language with caution when you see planning behaviors in the same lane. Years passed. The legal label did not change, manslaughter by diminished responsibility, and neither did the sentence, 26 years in total. What did change was the public conversation. Domestic homicide isn't one headline, it's an issue that threads through courts, clinics, schools, and neighborhoods. In Windsor, people who never met Joanna learned her name because the facts were clear, the advocacy was steady, and the case became a reference point when agencies trained on risk. As the calendar moved toward the halfway point of the sentence, new questions formed about release mechanics, what automatic means in practice, what powers ministers have, and how the parole board evaluates risk when a case involves extreme violence inside a home. Those questions are not gossip, they are the administrative tale of every serious conviction. They set the stage for the next phase of this story, the challenge to automatic release and the ministerial decision to block it pending parole board scrutiny. A brief note to the audience, this section is not about anger, it's about accountability. Families can honor someone they lost without inflating the record. Investigators can protect future victims by insisting on accurate signals, not dramatic ones. And communities can hold both ideas at once, compassion for the people left behind and a clear eye for the behaviors that lead to harm. A sentence doesn't end at the judge's words, it moves into administration. Under the 2011 order, halfway release would be considered around late 2023. In this case, that consideration never became a date. The Justice Secretary exercised statutory powers to stop automatic halfway release and referred the case to the parole board for a full risk assessment. That is not a retrial and not an appeal. It is a structured review, offense method, behavior in custody, and whether supervision in the community could actually manage risk. The original record led that review. A lethal assault inside Joanna Simpson's home, removal, a straight-sided grave in Windsor Great Park, a large storage container recovered with her remains, post-mortem identifying multiple hammer blows. No attempt to seek help. None of this is reheated for drama, it's the same proven sequence the jury saw. In release decisions, method matters because it shows planning, follow-through, and the capacity to conceal harm. That is why this file did not fade after sentencing. The prisoner challenged the ministerial block. Courts examined the decision and left it in place. That kept the case within the parole board's lane while preserving ministerial oversight. As of October 24, 2025, the status is clear, there is no automatic release. Any change in custody depends on the board's assessment and the minister's response. If risk cannot be managed, release does not happen. That's the process at work, not speculation, not public pressure, just the record and the law. Families live in the space between what happened and what happens next. Joanna's family chose steady advocacy, factual, survivor-focused, and aimed at prevention. Their message is practical: recognize escalation early, document coercive control, share information across agencies. Those steps sound small until you count the cases where no one wrote anything down until it was too late. Communities have a role here too. If you see isolation, stalking, or threats, report them. Safety grows from ordinary interventions made on time. It is also important to state the outcome once, without hedging. The jury's verdict stands: manslaughter by diminished responsibility, plus obstructing a coroner. The sentence stands: 26 years in total. The later release phase did not split this story into two versions. It adjusted the path of the sentence at the halfway mark and required independent risk testing before any step into the community. That is where the case remains. So we close on one arc, not two. A mother, Joanna Simpson, was killed in Windsor and buried nearby. A defendant, Robert Brown, was convicted and imprisoned. The state now controls the gate on any future release, with public safety, not the calendar, deciding the pace. Justice here is a chain of decisions made with documents in hand. The best respect for Joanna is to keep those documents clear, use them correctly, and let them protect the next person who might need help before a night turns fatal. I've walked you through one hard case, and here's what I carry forward: violence at home rarely starts at the fatal night. If you see control, isolation, or threats, document it, tell someone, and ask for help early. Justice works best when ordinary people speak up on time. What's your take? Should release reviews weigh offense method more than promises of change? Drop your view, where you're watching from, and what you'd do differently in your town. If this story helped or challenged you, say why or why not. And if you found value here, hit subscribe to join us for the next case.